My daughter's husband told her that I was too poor to be worth keeping around. Your father is the problem, he told her. My daughter believed him and gradually drifted away from me. 2 years later, believing he had successfully isolated my daughter, he filed for divorce and hired a lawyer to seize all of my assets, brimming with confidence in his plan. However, that was until his lawyer discovered secrets he could never have imagined. That was the day he realized he had accidentally sent the email of his plan to me instead of his accomplice. The fact that you're here means something to me. Before we go further, drop your country or city in the comments. Let me know where in the world this story is reaching. Note this narrative includes fictional elements crafted for entertainment and reflection. Any resemblance to specific names or places is unintentional, but the weight of what it carries is worth sitting with. It is November of 2025, and I am sitting at the kitchen table in Harlow Ridge, Colorado, with a cup of coffee I have let go, cold, trying to figure out where exactly a story like this one begins. Not when it started, because stories like this do not have clean starting lines. They have weight. They build across ordinary days inside moments that seem unremarkable while they are happening, pressing quietly until the day arrives when the whole accumulation has taken on a shape you can finally name out loud. I have been carrying this particular shape for nearly 7 years now, turning it over, setting it down, picking it back up. And I think the honest place to begin is with a distinction. The distinction between being surprised by something and having it confirmed. This is entirely the second kind of story. It was never about surprise. Before I tell you what happened, let me tell you who I am. Not because introductions make for better storytelling, but because the facts of who I am, what I spent my career doing, how I thought about contracts and conversations and the structure underneath both, and why I built what I built in the quiet way that I built it, are the reason this story ends the way it does. You cannot understand what I did without understanding what kind of man does such a thing, and what kind of years, one at a time, went into making him that way. My name is Frank Donnelly. I am 60 years old. I live in a 4-bedroom house on the western edge of Harlow Ridge, a small, unhurried community settled against the Colorado foothills, about an hour outside Denver, in a house I have owned free and clear since 2006. For 28 years before I retired in 2018, I worked as a civilian federal contract auditor for the Department of Defense. That title produces polite nods at social gatherings and very little else, and I have always understood why. What it actually describes is more specific. For nearly 3 decades, my professional purpose was to read documents that other people would have preferred not to have examined too closely, and locate the precise places where what was written did not correspond to what was real. You do that kind of work long enough, it changes the way you hear everything outside the office as well. My first supervising director, a man named Harold Bates, who held our division together for 16 years on black coffee and an unhurried, relentless form of attention, said something to me in the early part of my second year that has never fully left me. We had just finished working through a particularly complicated set of submissions, and he pushed back from his desk and said, "Frank, once you've read enough contracts written to deceive, you stop listening to what people say. You start listening to the structure of what they're saying, because the structure is where the intent lives. Every single time." I was 24 years old. I thought Harold Bates was being deliberately philosophical, in the way experienced professionals sometimes are with younger ones, a gesture toward wisdom more than a firm instruction. By the time I was 35, I understood that he had given me the most concrete professional guidance I would ever receive, stated plainly, without a single unnecessary word. There is a chair at this kitchen table, the one directly across from where I am sitting, that has been empty for 7 years. I am not going to explain whose chair that was, not yet. Some things carry their proper weight only when they arrive in the right sequence, and that particular absence belongs later in this story, in a place where it can mean what it is supposed to mean. What I can tell you now is the garden. The one visible through the back window, running along the fence line in both directions, growing with the kind of deliberate, patient order that takes years of knowing what you are doing to establish. Patricia planted every inch of it. She knew the name of every plant in those beds, the familiar name, and the correct one. She knew which ones needed full sun, which ones the Colorado frost would injure without heavy mulching come fall, which ones you cut down hard in October, not because they are finished, but because that kind of hard reduction is exactly how you get what those plants have in them the following spring. Over 7 winters of careful, honest effort, I have learned which ones come back. That is the complete extent of my knowledge about that garden. It has been enough to keep things alive. I am not entirely certain that keeping things alive is the same thing as keeping them well. I do it regardless. People ask me now, since everything has come to its conclusion, how I feel about the way it ended. I consider that question carefully before answering. Because the precise answer is the only one worth giving, I feel the correct outcome occurred. Not the comfortable one, not the satisfying one in the way people usually mean that word, with its implication of scores arranged and consequences absorbed where you wanted them. The correct one. The one that the facts, laid out without flattering omissions, had pointed toward from the very beginning. My daughter asked me not long after the final papers were signed, "Dad, were you ever actually scared through any of this?" I held that question for a moment before I answered her. Scared isn't quite the right word, I said. Careful is the right word. In any situation with real stakes, there is always a version where you get it wrong. I stayed careful because of that version. She looked at me. The way she sometimes does, a look I recognized immediately because her mother used to direct it from the same angle and said, "You're going to explain all of that at some point, aren't you?" "Yes," I said. "I am." This is that explanation. I want to be clear before we go any further about what kind of story this is. This is not the story of a man who was wronged and then got angry. Anger is for situations you did not see coming. What I am going to tell you is the story of a man who watched something approach over a long period of time, made no loud announcements about it, and spent a quiet number of years ensuring that when the moment finally came, the arithmetic did not work out the way the other party had designed it to work. The difference between those two accounts is the whole point. One is about a victim. The other is about a plan. After 28 years of reading other people's contracts, I know the difference between those two things. Before I tell you about the moment when everything I had quietly suspected received its confirmation, I need you to understand what I actually owned and what no one around me knew about it. Because the rest of this story depends entirely on the distance between what a man appears to have and what he actually holds. In this particular case, that distance was everything. Let me go back 24 years, because understanding what I built is the only way the rest of this story holds together. Everything that came later, every decision I made, every structure I put in place, every piece of documentation I kept when keeping it, seemed unnecessary traces back to a single professional year when I learned the hardest lesson available to a man who had spent his career trusting that good work speaks for itself. It does not always speak for itself. Sometimes it needs a paper trail. The year was 1999. I was 34 years old, 11 months into the most significant audit engagement of my career. To that point, a defense logistics contract approaching $400 million in federal obligations. I had built the documentation from scratch, the findings, the analysis, the conclusions sequenced through a structure I had thought through carefully enough to reproduce in my sleep. Working alongside me for 7 of those months was a man I had known since my first departmental posting, someone I had trusted with the kind of professional confidence that forms when two people spend long hours reviewing difficult material in the same room over a sustained period of time, without either one needing to say how much they trust the other. He submitted the work as his own, not a portion of it. All of it. He walked into the division director's office with a bound report bearing his name and a structure that was mine down to the ordering of the subsections. What followed was 11 days of internal review. 11 days I have no interest in describing at length. Partly because the memory of them is not pleasant, and partly because the way they ended does not fully flatter me either. I had no independent record. I had treated the working relationship as its own form of documentation, which is the kind of professional reasoning that seems logical until it costs you everything. The division ultimately ruled in my favor, but only narrowly, and only because an administrative clerk had retained a set of draft timestamps the other man hadn't thought to locate and destroy. His oversight, not my preparation. Afterwards, standing in the corridor outside the director's office, the man passed me on his way toward the elevator. He did not slow down. He looked at me with a steady, perfectly managed expression and said, "You got lucky, Frank." Then he kept walking. I stood in that corridor for a long time after he was gone. I was 34 years old, and what I understood standing there was simple. The most dangerous place to keep something that belongs to you is inside a relationship you haven't bothered to document. Memory is not ownership. Trust is not a filing system. Structure is the only thing that holds when the surrounding conditions change. That principle became the architecture of everything I built afterward. Beginning in 2001, I started constructing a financial life in parallel with my government salary. Quietly, methodically, with exactly the deliberateness I applied to the audit work itself. I understood from professional experience that the visibility of a thing and the value of a thing are entirely separate matters, and they do not need to be connected. I drove sensible cars, a 2012 Jeep Cherokee, by the time any of this becomes relevant to the story. I did not join a country club. I did not discuss money as a social subject. I let people construct whatever financial picture they wanted to construct from what they could observe, and I took no interest in correcting it. What a man appears to own and what he actually owns are different ledgers. Most people only ever see one of them. Here is what the other one contained. A house in Harlow Ridge, Colorado, purchased in 2006, paid in full that same year, carrying no mortgage and no lien against it. Current market value at the time of this story, $920,000. 46 acres of timberland in northwestern Montana, acquired in 2005 at a price that reflected a seller in a hurry and a buyer with patience. I had leased it immediately to a sustainable forestry operation that paid quarterly, without fail, maintained the land better than I would have, and required very little from me in return, except for continued invisibility as the property owner. Current value $2,400,000. A founding investment in a small restaurant group made in 2008 when they had 2 locations, a gifted chef who couldn't read a balance sheet, and a financing need that no bank wanted to touch during the financial collapse. I touched it. They had grown to 11 locations across Colorado and New Mexico since then. My original stake was worth $2,100,000, a silent partnership in a regional freight logistics company, established in 2010 with 3 colleagues from separate departments who needed a capital partner willing to remain completely invisible in the company structure. I had 28 years of experience remaining professionally invisible when the situation called for it. Current value $1,200,000. And a family trust established in 2014 for Claire and Daniel, structured with entirely discretionary distributions, meaning I controlled when and whether anything moved out of it. Nothing was scheduled. Nothing flowed automatically on a fixed calendar. Current value $650,000. Total $7,270,000. Built over 24 years. Undiscussed. Unannounced in any social setting. Documented, precisely held entirely. Patricia had known the general shape of what I was doing, if not the specific numbers. I had explained the logic to her one evening after the children were in bed, and she had listened with the specific attention she brought to things she intended to consider seriously. When I finished, she said, So we live like people who don't have it. That's more or less the idea, I said. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I can do that. I've never been interested in the signals anyway. She went back to her book. I went back to my notes. That was the complete extent of the conversation. She never raised the subject again, and neither did I. Some agreements don't need to be renegotiated once they're made. By November of 2019, when Marcus Webb arrived at my front door, carrying the correct bottle of wine and the prepared expression of a man who had done his research, he was looking at a retired federal auditor in a modest house in a quiet Colorado community, driving a used Jeep with no visible markers of anything beyond a comfortable government retirement. Whatever financial picture he assembled from that observation was probably reasonable for a man of my general profile. He was not wrong about what he could see. He had simply assumed that the ledger he could see was the only ledger there was. None of this would have mattered at all if the man my daughter married had been the man she believed he was. But Marcus Webb had been studying other people's financial arrangements for considerably longer than I had been watching him, and he had been doing it with a very specific kind of purpose. I just didn't understand that yet. What I also didn't yet understand was that he hadn't arrived at my table entirely on his own instinct. He'd had help finding the door. Before Marcus Webb, there was Patricia. And before I can tell you anything that came after, I need to tell you about the afternoon 6 months after we buried her, when I found the letter she had never finished writing. Patricia Donnelly was not a woman who expressed herself in the way most people expect love to be expressed. She did not use the word casually. In 31 years of marriage, I heard her say it deliberately with intention, which meant I always knew exactly what she meant when she said it. She communicated through attention, through remembering 3 weeks later, something you had mentioned in passing and following up on it without being asked. Through the garden she built in the yard over the course of a decade, planting what she planted. Not because it looked good, but because, as she told me once, everything worth keeping needs something to keep it. That principle extended in her view to plants, to people, and to the specific kind of silence between two people that means more than conversation. She grew peonies along the south fence, lavender beside the back gate, a climbing rose against the rear wall that required 3 full seasons before it produced a single flower. She was patient in a way I admired and could not replicate. She tended those plants in the early mornings before I was properly awake, and she knew what they needed, the way you know the face of someone you have been watching for 30 years. Not because you cataloged them, because you were paying attention all along. She died in October of 2018. The medical term was a cardiac event, sudden, severe, unsurvivable. She was 57 years old. The week before, she had been tired in a way she mentioned once, casually, and I had taken at face value. I have thought about that particular failure many times since, and I have not yet found a way to be at peace with it, which is perhaps how it should be. Claire was 29 when her mother died. She flew in from Denver the following morning and stayed for 2 weeks without being asked. I watched her move through those 14 days in the specific way I imagined she had learned to move through. Hard things functioning completely on the outside, while something essential was being reorganized underneath. She handled the calls, the arrangements, the meals with a steady, practical care I recognized as her mother's. On the last morning before she flew home, she stood in the kitchen in her coat with her bag already by the door, and she said, "Call me if you need anything, Dad. Anything at all." I told her I would. She knew I probably wouldn't, and she accepted that because she knew me. That, too, was her mother's quality. The reading room sat off the back hallway, a small converted space Patricia had taken years ago. Shelves on 3 walls, 2 chairs, a lamp she had selected for the particular warmth of its light in the evening hours. After the service, I closed the door. I did not open it again for 6 months. I told myself it was because the room needed proper attention, careful sorting. The truth, if I am going to account for myself honestly, was simpler. I was not ready. Some rooms hold still for you when you are not able to enter them, and I was not yet able. In April, the contractor I had hired to address a settling crack along the north wall told me he needed access. He stood in the hallway with his hands in his jacket and said, "Mr. Donnelly, that back wall is where the whole issue runs. I need it cleared by Thursday." I told him I would have it ready. It took most of a morning. I worked slowly and did not hurry myself. I moved her books the way she had kept them in the order they sat on the shelves, their arrangements preserved as best I could manage, stacked carefully into banker's boxes with the spines facing the same direction. She would have noticed if they hadn't been. On the lowest shelf between two books I did not recognize the titles of was a blue cloth notebook, the specific kind she had used for years, small, its pages thickened from repeated handling. I opened it before I put it in a box because it seemed important to know what it held. The early pages were reading notes, observations on things she had been working through, questions she had written to herself, single sentences that had apparently stopped her somewhere mid-chapter, then a grocery list, then more notes, then between pages 46 and 48, an envelope. Unsealed. My name written on the front in her handwriting, unhurried, unambiguous hers. Inside was a note card, partially written. A birthday card for me dated 3 months before she died. She had been tired that week. The handwriting was slightly looser than her usual clarity, but recognizably hers. She had written about Daniel first, a brief line measured proud in the restrained way she was proud of things. Then she had written about Claire. Claire has your steadiness, and my way of opening to people completely. I have always thought that combination was a beautiful one. I have also always thought it required someone who deserves both. Watch for the right person. You will know. The card stopped there. No signature. She had not been able to finish it. I read it twice. The second time more slowly than the first, with the specific attention of someone trying to understand not just the words, but the conditions under which they were written. Then I folded it back into the envelope along the same creases, and I put it in the breast pocket of my shirt. Not in one of the boxes, not in a drawer, on my person. I cannot give you a fully articulate reason for that instinct, except to say that some things deserve to be kept close until you understand what they are asking of you. Through the reading room window, the garden was already beginning to show the signs of a season without the attention it was accustomed to. The peonies needed work I did not yet know how to do. The climbing rose along the back wall was going in directions Patricia would have corrected weeks ago. Somewhere in the house, the contractor was talking on his phone, and outside, it was the particular clear light of a Colorado spring afternoon. And none of that touched the fact of the card in my pocket. Patricia had not known about Marcus Webb. He had not yet come into existence as a fact in our lives. She had written about Claire, without any knowledge of what was coming, written only from 31 years of watching her daughter grow into herself, and from a very specific instinct about what that combination of qualities required in a partner. She was right. I just needed several more years to understand in exactly which way. 7 months after the afternoon, I found that letter my daughter called me from a restaurant in downtown Harlow Ridge to tell me she had met someone. I asked his name. She said Marcus. She said it the way people say a name when they have already decided it is going to carry weight in their life. I told her that was wonderful, and I meant every word. I put the phone down. I did not immediately think about the letter I had moved from my shirt pocket to the top desk drawer. But I thought about it late that night. I thought about the last sentence, about what Patricia had meant by deserves. He came to the house on a Saturday evening in November of 2019, and within the first 20 minutes, I understood that I was sitting across from someone who had done a considerable amount of preparation before arriving. He rang the bell at exactly 6:30. Not early, not late calibrated. He was wearing a jacket that was well chosen without being showy, and he was carrying a bottle of Sonoma Coast Pinot Noir that I recognized immediately as the specific wine Claire had mentioned once, briefly, during a phone call nearly 6 months earlier. Not recently. 6 months. The ability to retain what a person mentions in passing and deploy it at the correct moment is not a social grace. It is a practiced technique. I noted it before he had cleared the doorway. He introduced himself with a handshake that communicated exactly the right degree of confidence enough to mean something not enough to be read as pressure. I introduced him to Daniel, my son, who had driven down from Denver that afternoon. Daniel works in enterprise software infrastructure, the kind of work that resists easy explanation to people who aren't already inside it. Within 7 minutes, Marcus had found the frequency. He turned to Daniel and said, "Claire mentioned you're in software. What problem are you actually trying to solve day to day?" It was the only question that unlocks that kind of conversation, and Marcus had found it on the first attempt. Daniel talked for the better part of 20 minutes. I did not interrupt. I was watching. With Claire, Marcus was easy and warm, the particular ease of a man with someone he has already made comfortable, someone to whom no effort is being directed, because the groundwork has already been laid. He touched the back of her chair when he moved past it. He answered her father's questions before she had to translate them. He did nothing that would have looked wrong to anyone in that room. That was the note I kept returning to. Nothing wrong. Everything performed with a precision that looked exactly like naturalness. The financial questions began before we had finished the appetizers, and they continued at intervals through the next 2 hours of the meal. I counted them as they arrived, not consciously. At first, but in the way that certain patterns become visible once you have been trained to look for their structure. The first came while we were still standing near the kitchen island, before we had moved to the table. He looked around the room with the attentiveness of a man absorbing information rather than appreciating space and said, "Is this place all yours, or are you still carrying a note on it?" "Paid it off some years back," I said. Accurate. Minimal. Nothing that required a follow-up. He nodded as if I had confirmed something pleasant and moved on. The second arrived between courses in the gap that opens when one subject has finished and the next hasn't started yet. He said, "Federal retirement, that's a different kind of security than the private sector. Real consistency, I imagine." I said the benefit structure had been reliable and steered the conversation toward something Daniel had mentioned about his current project. Marcus accepted the redirection without visible resistance. He had the patience of someone who understood that a single dinner was not the only opportunity he would have. The third came with the wine refill, delivered with the comfort of a man who has discovered no friction in the room. Property taxes on a place this size and this county, does that get complicated to manage? I told him the county assessor's office had been straightforward to work with over the years. He nodded again. Another note made behind an expression that showed nothing but casual interest. The remaining 8 questions were spread across the next hour and a half, about the Jeep Cherokee in the driveway, about how long I had lived in Harlow Ridge, about whether I had kept active with colleagues from the department, about what I found worth doing with time, now that the workdays no longer had the same shape. Each question arrived inside a larger conversation, dressed in the clothing of interest, spaced at intervals that prevented them from clustering into something that might have felt like an interview. The craft of it was real. If I had not been counting, I might not have noticed how many there were. Daniel noticed none of it. He was open and unguarded and generous with information about his own life, in the way that a person is when he feels genuinely at ease with someone, which Marcus had made happen deliberately and made look effortless. I did not fault Daniel for this. There is nothing wrong with being comfortable in your own home with a man your sister cares about. Comfort is not a character flaw. I observed it and registered it. Claire watched Marcus the way her mother used to watch things she had already decided about, not evaluating, but confirming. The decision had been made. She was at that stage of watching where you show people where you already stand, rather than asking for their permission to stand there. I knew that look well. I had spent 31 years watching it settle across the same face a generation earlier. I answered every question, the way I had answered questions in federal audit interviews for 28 years, enough to satisfy the surface requirement. Nothing that provided real structural information. Complete in form, empty in content. I had not practiced that balance in any social context before. It had not occurred to me that I might need to. When they left Claire with a kiss at the door, Marcus with the same measured handshake he had arrived with, I stood in the doorway until his car reached the end of the street. Then I went inside and walked to the kitchen, where I keep a small spiral notebook in the second drawer beside the stove. I sat down at the kitchen table and wrote the date at the top of a clean page. Beneath it, I wrote down all 11 questions in the sequence they had arrived, with the framing intact, not just the subject, but the specific angle of approach and the surrounding conversation each one had been embedded in. I wrote them the way I had been trained to document audit observations, not what I thought they meant, but exactly what they were. When I was finished, I read the list from the beginning. 11 questions about property ownership, retirement income, asset management, and financial structure, delivered over the course of a dinner by a man who had been seeing my daughter for 3 weeks. Framed well, spaced correctly, impossible to object to in isolation, unmistakable in aggregate. Nobody asks 11 financially specific questions at a first family dinner unless they have had reason to learn how to ask them. I put the notebook back in the drawer. The driveway was dark. The November evening settled into the yard outside. I had no documentation of intent. I had a list of questions and a professional instinct about what the list meant. In 28 years of federal auditing, I had learned that moving before you have documentation does not close a problem. It announces you and creates 2 problems where there had been 1. I was not going to announce myself. Not yet. The 22 months between that first dinner and the wedding were on the surface exactly what a father hopes to see when his daughter finds someone she is serious about. Marcus came to the house regularly. He remembered things which, as I have come to understand, a skill that can mean very different things depending on what a person does with what they remember. He knew how I took my coffee by his 3rd visit and brought it correctly from the kitchen without being asked. When Daniel mentioned at dinner in January of 2020 that he had been reading about distributed system architecture, a book arrived at Daniel's apartment 4 days later. The specific text that led the current literature on the subject, with a brief handwritten note. When Claire, on some occasion, I was not present for, had spoken to Marcus about her mother, the details found their way into family conversations at exactly the right moments, a reference to the garden, an acknowledgement of a date that mattered. These were not the gestures of a man who cared. They were the outputs of a man who had been listening carefully and understood the value of what he had heard. I noted all of it. I said very little. In the spring of 2020, Daniel and I were standing at the kitchen counter after a Sunday dinner, while Marcus and Claire were in the living room. Daniel watched them for a moment and said, "He's good for her, Dad." I considered the statement. "He's very good at this," I said. Daniel looked at me. "That's the same thing." I did not explain that it was not. I did not have sufficient documentation to explain it, and I had been in enough professional situations to know that stating a conclusion you cannot yet support creates more difficulty than silence does. I picked up my coffee and let it go. Claire had done what most careful people do when they are becoming serious about someone. She had searched Marcus's name online from more than one angle over more than one sitting. She found nothing that concerned her. A professional profile and some real estate development postings. No red flags, no inconsistencies. What she could not have known, what neither of us understood until much later in this story, was why certain things were absent from that search. What I eventually learned was that Marcus had been previously married briefly to a woman in Tucson, Arizona. The divorce had been processed through a small rural county court, whose physical records had not yet been transferred to any digitally searchable system at the time Claire was looking. It was not that the record didn't exist. It was that the record existed in a format that required knowing exactly where to look and provided you were in a different state. With no specific reason to search that particular county, you would find nothing. I came to understand later that this was not accidental. A man who plans carefully chooses the coordinates of his prior history the same way he chooses everything else. The wedding took place on a Saturday in September of 2021 at a small venue in the foothills west of Harlow Ridge that Claire had found and planned almost entirely by herself. The weather was what September in Colorado can be when it decides to cooperate the mountains sharp and clear to the west. The air carrying that particular dry warmth that feels like the last honest thing before the cold moves in. Claire wore a dress in ivory, and she was by any measure I am capable of applying luminous. I watched her walk toward the front of the room, and I thought about her mother, and I thought about what her mother had written in the letter I had moved from my desk drawer to my jacket pocket that morning, because some days require certain things to be close. Marcus stood at the front of the room in a dark suit, and he read his vows with the composure of someone who had found exactly the right words and practiced their delivery to the correct degree. He said, "I choose you, not because you are what I needed, but because you are what I did not know to look for." And the room responded to it the way rooms respond to the right line delivered at the right moment. I watched his eyes as he said it. They were steady, controlled in the way that eyes are when the speaker is managing the effect they are producing, rather than experiencing the thing itself. I noted it. I let it go. He had 11 guests on his side, some former colleagues, a cousin from Phoenix, a close friend from his time in Arizona. I counted them because counting is something I do when I want to understand the shape of a situation. 9 on our side, including Daniel and 2 of Claire's university friends. I thought about the guest list, about what a man's 11 guests reveal about the depth of his social roots, and what it means when that number is contained and curated. I made a note of the count in a way that left no visible trace. At the reception, I watched Marcus move through the room. He was attentive to the right people, economical with his time, present in all the ways a person is supposed to be present at an event designed to welcome them into a family. He brought Claire's aunts a second glass of wine without being asked. He told one of her university friends something that made her laugh in a way that was entirely genuine. He did all of this well. That was not the issue. The issue was the consistency of it. The unbroken quality of the performance from the moment he had walked through my door 22 months earlier until this evening. Across conditions that varied, casual dinners and formal occasions, moments of real feeling, and moments of professional politeness without ever dropping register, without a single unguarded moment that I had been able to observe. A man who is genuinely who he presents himself to be gets tired sometimes. He lets the surface drop for an hour. He forgets to be anything in particular. Marcus Webb in 22 months had not once forgotten. I drove home from the reception in the September evening, the Colorado light thin and honest the way it gets in early fall. I thought about the notebook in my kitchen drawer and the 11 questions from November 2019. And I thought about something I had no evidence for and could not name outright. That a man who performs with this consistency across this span of time and this range of conditions has had occasion to develop it somewhere before. I reached the house. I told myself I was an unreasonable father reading too much into too little. I almost believed it. 8 months actually, no. Let me be precise. The first changes arrived in the first month of the marriage. September of 2021. I want to state that with exactness, because precision is what separates documentation from impression, and what I am going to tell you about the following 10 weeks deserves to be documented, not merely described. The Sunday dinners had been loosely maintained through the fall, the kind of loose maintenance that is understandable in a newly married couple building their own rhythm, and which I made no comment about. Then in September, Claire and Marcus were expected on a Sunday evening and did not arrive. No call before, no message during. I waited, then called. I left a voicemail. Claire returned it the following day, briefly, practically with no offered explanation and no alternative date. I noted it. By October, the intervals between calls had stretched in a way that was beginning to lose its plausible explanation. When I called one afternoon and reached voicemail, 3 days passed before she called back. That is a specific measurement, not an impression. 3 days is what the log recorded. When she called, the content of the conversation was fine. Every statement was technically accurate. Things are busy. We're settling in. Marcus has a lot going on with work. Complete sentences, nothing left open, nothing that invited a follow-up without seeming to press. I said, "It sounds like a full stretch." She said, "It really is, but we're good." An auditor hears the structure under the words, not just the words themselves. What I heard was not evasion, because evasion leaves gaps. What I heard was management. A managed answer has no gaps. It is complete in form and carefully empty in content. I had heard it many times across many tables. I called Daniel that evening. He said what I had already suspected: her messages to him had grown shorter, more widely spaced, less specific. He mentioned it the way Daniel mentions concerning things lightly, without pressing a conclusion, leaving the analysis to whoever else is in the room. "She seems fine," he said. "Just quieter." When I told him I had noticed the same thing. We said goodnight. I took out a new notebook the next morning. I dated the first page and began the contact log. Date. Method: call, text message through Daniel. Response time in days. Quality: 3 categories I borrowed directly from my federal audit observation protocols, open, managed, or guarded. A contact log is not a dramatic document. It is a straightforward one. I had maintained variations of this kind of record for 28 years, for exactly the reason it applies here if something is happening in a consistent direction. The record will show its shape clearly, and you will not have to argue about whether the shape exists. In early November, I called again, and this time Claire answered directly. I asked her plainly whether everything was all right. Not the casual version of the question, the actual one. She said, "Everything's fine, Dad. We're still getting settled. It just takes longer than you think." "I'm not asking about the settling," I said. "I'm asking about you, specifically." A pause, longer than the question required. "I'm good. I really am." I said what I had decided by that point I was going to say, and not add to, "You know where I am, Claire. That hasn't changed." She said, "I know, Dad." Then a pause that ran 3-4 seconds. "I know." Those were the first words she had said in that call that were not managed. I recognized the quality of them instantly, the specific weight of a sentence that a person says to themselves as much as to the person they're saying it to. I did not fill the silence that followed. I let it be what it was. I entered the call in the log when we hung up. November 7th, phone, direct. Managed with isolated exception. Then I closed the notebook. I sat at the kitchen table for a long time in the November dark. The garden outside was bare and still. Nothing was asking anything of me in that moment, except to think clearly about what I was going to do, which is a thing I am reasonably practiced at. I made 3 decisions. The first, I would not call more often than she called me. Whatever was happening inside that house, a father calling repeatedly from the outside would not help. It would give the other party a narrative, the overbearing father, the interference that could be used against her. I would not supply that narrative. The second, I would not create occasions for contact that forced her to explain herself in a situation I could not see. Showing up unannounced, however reasonable it might feel to me, would create friction that she would have to manage in a space I had no access to. That was not fair to her. The third took longer. I sat with it until it arrived fully. I thought about the letter from my desk drawer, Patricia's handwriting, the sentence that had stopped partway through, about what it means to be present for someone who cannot currently acknowledge that you are there. And I understood what I had to offer that required nothing from her and asked for no response. 3 cards a year. Handwritten. Her birthday in August. The anniversary of Patricia's death in October. Christmas. Each one would close with the same line I had said on that phone call. I am here. That has not changed. Not a question. Not a request. A single verifiable fact delivered in an envelope, arriving in a mailbox where Marcus Webb had no reason to object to its presence, because it was nothing more than a father writing to his daughter. It carried nothing urgent. It carried everything I had. I did not know if she would be the one to open them. I decided that was beside the point. What I had in the closed notebook on that table was not worry. It was data. A documented record of contacts declining in both frequency and openness over a 10-week period, beginning within weeks of the wedding, following a consistent direction without variation. Data has a weight that feeling does not have. I had spent my career understanding the difference. On the evening of the 14th of November, I know the date precisely because it is in the log. I was at my desk, reviewing a personal financial email account I kept separate from my main correspondence. There was a message in the inbox sent to me by mistake. The intended recipient's address differed from mine by exactly 2 letters. I opened it. I read it once. Then I sat completely still for a long time. Before I show you the exact words in that email, the one that arrived in the wrong inbox, addressed to the wrong man, at 11 o'clock at night, drop the number 7 in the comments right now. Let me know you're still here. Because what comes next is the moment this story stopped being a feeling and became a document. A quick note. Some details in this story have been reconstructed for storytelling purposes. If that's not the kind of content you want to continue with, you can stop right here. That choice is entirely yours. I want to tell you exactly what the email said, because the specific language of it is what made it. What it was, not a suspicion I still couldn't name. Not an impression drawn from the arrangement of 11 questions over a dinner table 2 years earlier, but a document. A piece of written evidence with a date, a sender, and a stated intention. I want to give it to you the way I gave it to myself that evening, precisely without editorializing in order. The subject line read, R.E. Donnelly Trust Angle and Window. The sender was Marcus Webb. The account was his personal email, not a work address, which told me, before I had read a single line of the body, that this was not routine business correspondence. It was a private exchange being conducted through a channel he associated with things he wanted to keep away from his company server. I read it once. Then I read it again. Marcus had been trying to reach a man named Frank Donnellan, a development consultant whose email address was fdonnellan, at a domain I recognized as a real estate advisory firm. My address was fdonnelly. 2 letters adjacent in the autofill suggestions that appear when you begin typing a name you have contacted before. I had emailed Marcus twice in 18 months, once about the wedding venue, once about a dinner arrangement. I was in his contacts. So was Donnellan. He had typed the first 6 characters and selected the wrong suggestion. It is the kind of error that happens once, costs everything, and cannot be undone. The email reproduced as accurately as I could manage that evening, before the details had any chance to shift. Frank, following up on our Tuesday call regarding the Donnelly situation. I've had a chance to review the trust documentation Claire mentioned, and I think there's a workable angle here. The annual distributions her father has been providing, if we can characterize those as marital income under Colorado statute, she has a current beneficial interest in the trust itself. That's accessible in a dissolution proceeding. Need you to look at whether the discretionary language in the original document gives us the room we need, or whether we're going to run into a wall there. If the language is tight, we'll need a different approach. The window we discussed is still Q3 of next year. Both projects need a cash position by then that I don't currently have. This is the most direct path. Keep the trust angle away from Claire for now. I don't need her asking questions before we've mapped the full structure. I put the phone down on the desk slowly in the deliberate way of someone who wants to be careful with small motions, because the larger situation requires steadiness. I read the email a second time. What I felt reading it the second time was not what most people would expect. It was not fear. It was not anger. What a man experiences when a 2-year suspicion is confirmed in specific, detailed, written form is not surprise. It is recognition. I had documented 11 questions in a notebook in November of 2019. I had maintained a contact log through a period of systematic narrowing. I had watched a performance run across 22 months without a single unguarded moment. Recognition, when it arrives, carries a particular quality of weight, not the sharp weight of something new, but the settled weight of something that was already there. I knew what I had. I needed to be precise about what to do with it. I printed the email. I did not save it only to the screen because screens are not documentation, they are displays, and displays can be argued about. I printed it, waited for the page to come through, held it, read it one more time from the physical paper. Then I put it in a manila folder I took from the second drawer of my desk. I stood up and went to the kitchen. The coffee I had brewed that evening was still in the pot. I poured it down the sink. I have done many things in my life out of habit, and the majority of them are worth examining. And this is one I have thought about since. Why, at that specific moment, did I pour out coffee that was still usable and make a fresh pot? I think the honest answer is that some moments require a deliberate act to mark them. The old coffee belonged to the evening before I had read the email. I was now in a different evening, and it required something fresh and intentional. I made a new pot. While it brewed, I went back to the desk. In the second kitchen drawer, not the study, the kitchen, where I had kept it. Since November of 2019 was the small spiral notebook with 11 questions written in my handwriting on the second page. I took it out and brought it to the folder. I put both items inside. The notebook from 2 years ago containing the questions a man asks when he has already decided what he is looking for, and the email from tonight containing the mechanism he intended to use to get it. Together they told a clear story, not an impression, not a concern, a documented pattern of intent with a 2-year span and a specific legal strategy. 28 years of reading fraudulent government contract submissions teaches you to recognize what a specification document looks like. It does not look like a crime. It looks like a plan that is still in motion, organized, professional, using the language of legitimate procedure. That is what I held in the folder. A plan that had been set in motion by a man who believed he understood the asset structure he was working against, and who had made his timeline contingent on that structure remaining exactly as he had assessed it. He did not know that the assessment was wrong. I had not told him. I had not told anyone. I stood at the kitchen counter with the coffee and looked out the back window at the November dark. The garden was a silence of bare shapes. Patricia's peonies were under the ground, doing what they do in winter, not dying waiting. I stood there for perhaps 5 minutes. Then I picked up the phone and called Audrey Sims. Audrey was an estate attorney I had worked with for 14 years. She had drafted Patricia's will and handled the family trust documents in 2014, and she was the only lawyer I had ever trusted with information I genuinely did not want to become available to people I had not authorized. It was 9:47 in the evening. She answered on the second ring. "Audrey," I said. "I need to come in tomorrow morning." First thing, she did not ask what for. She asked the question that tells you what kind of professional you are dealing with. How serious, Frank? I considered the folder on my desk. I need you to tell me. When we're done, exactly how quickly everything I own can be made unreachable from the outside. 4 seconds of silence. Audrey processes information at a speed that most people do not recognize, because she does not make any visible sign of processing it. Then she said, 8 o'clock. I said I would be there. I put the phone down and sat at the kitchen table with the folder and the coffee, and I thought about one specific thing. A man who has built his entire strategy around a legal theory about a trust structure he has never read closely enough is a man whose plan depends on the thing he has not verified. I intended to verify it for him. By the time he went looking for what he expected to find, I intended to make certain it was no longer there. Audrey Sims's office on the 3rd floor of the Brixton building had looked the same in the 14 years I had known her organized, with the specific ruthlessness of someone who does not tolerate anything being where it is not supposed to be. The desk had a clear working space at the center and a precise arrangement of materials at the perimeter. When I arrived at 8 o'clock the morning after the email, she had the center cleared and waiting. She had known from the phone call that this was not a routine meeting. I placed 3 items on the desk in the order they had occurred. The printed email, the spiral notebook, with 11 questions dated November of 2019, and the contact log covering September through November of 2021. I said nothing. Audrey read them in sequence carefully, without asking for clarification or offering commentary while she was still moving through the documents. She finished the contact log and sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "He is not guessing. He is working from a framework, and the framework has a legal theory in it." "That's my read as well," I said. She set the papers down in the same arrangement she had found them. "The trust is the target. Specifically, the annual distributions Claire receives. His argument is that those distributions constitute a current beneficial interest, her stake in the trust's value, and that a current beneficial interest held during a marriage is marital property accessible in a dissolution proceeding." "Is the argument viable?" I asked. Audrey considered this in the way she considered legal questions, without hurrying toward the answer she would prefer. "In the trust's current form, with the existing distribution language referencing prior years as a baseline, it has traction. Colorado courts have entertained this theory before. Not a certainty, but enough to compel a hearing." She paused. "Which means we need to change the language before he ever files anything." The plan she laid out was specific. The Family Trust's 2014 documents contained language in the amendment provisions that referenced the history of annual payments language a plaintiff's attorney could use to argue a pattern of expected income, and expected income is legally adjacent to vested interest. Audrey's solution was to remove the baseline language entirely, redraft the distribution provisions, so that each annual decision stood alone contingent on nothing prior committed to nothing future, at the grantor's complete discretion with no interpretable pattern. Frank retained full control. Claire and Daniel remained named beneficiaries, but the legal hook, the single point Marcus's strategy required, would no longer exist in the document. For the remaining 4 assets, she outlined LLC structuring and documentary clarification to establish each asset's separate property character in language explicit enough to make any challenge costly and slow. The Montana Timberland, the restaurant stake, the logistics partnership. Each one would be documented not just as Frank's separate property, but as separate property with a paper trail clear enough to make the argument before any evidence was introduced. 3 to 4 months, she said. "I want it done correctly the first time." I told her to take what she needed. On the second day, Audrey brought in a forensic accountant she used on estate matters requiring detailed financial analysis. The woman's name was Lena. She arrived with 3 banker's boxes and a manner that suggested she had no patience for information that wasn't immediately useful. She did not introduce herself at length. She opened a box and began working, which I found more than sufficient. In the 2 weeks that followed, Working from Marcus's publicly available business filings, county property records, and development permit applications, Lena assembled a financial picture of his current situation that the email had hinted at, but not fully described. He had 2 active commercial real estate development projects in District 4 of Harlow Ridge, both significantly over-leveraged. Combined outstanding debt, $3.2 million. The financing structure on both projects included repayment triggers tied to a cash infusion requirement by the third quarter of 2022. Without a substantial new capital position within 9 months, both projects would default. I read Lena's summary carefully. "He didn't want my daughter's assets," I said. "He needed them. The difference matters." Lena looked up briefly from the second box. "The timeline is the tell," she said. "This is not a patient strategy. This is a deadline." She was right about that. A man who wants something will wait for the right moment. A man who needs something in 9 months is already behind. A plan built around urgency is a plan built around the assumption that everything will proceed as designed. It leaves very little room for the structure it depends on to have already changed. Audrey had established the working protocols from the first meeting. All correspondence routed through her office's P.O. box, no calls to Frank's residential address. No documentation mailed directly to the house. I suspended my Tuesday golf arrangement with Ted, citing a knee that had been unreliable in the cold weather, which was not entirely false, and which I did not feel required further explanation. I wanted no visible change in my routine that might signal activity. At the end of March, Audrey called me in to sign the finalized documents. We worked through everything methodically, page by page, the amended trust language, the LLC registrations for the timberland and logistics partnership, the updated titling and documentation for the restaurant stake. The process took most of a morning. When the last signature was dry and the documents were ordered, Audrey straightened the stack and looked across the desk. "Whoever comes at this from the other side," she said, "is not going to find what they're looking for." I picked up my pen and returned it to my jacket. "That, Audrey," I said, "is the entire point." I drove home from the Brixton building that afternoon, with every asset I owned organized behind structures that had no connection to Marcus Webb and never had. $3.2 million in debt against a Q3 deadline. A legal theory built around a trust provision that no longer existed in the form he believed it did. I thought about what a man discovers when he finally goes to execute a plan and finds that the foundation it required has already been replaced. There was still one question I had not answered. He had known exactly where to look at the trust, at the distributions, at the specific angle that could have worked. That level of precision did not come from general interest. It came from information about this family. I did not yet know who had provided it. It was a Tuesday in June of 2022, 9 months after the wedding, when I sat across from the oldest friend I had on a golf cart at the Harlow Ridge Municipal Course, and finally understood how Marcus Webb had known exactly where to begin. I had returned to the Tuesday rounds 2 weeks earlier, after the 3-month gap I had attributed to a knee issue. Ted Kowalski asked no questions about the absence. We had known each other long enough to understand that some pauses don't require accounting, and that a friendship worth having will resume at its own pace when the time is right. Ted had been one of my first friends in Harlow Ridge, met at a neighborhood gathering in 1992, when we had both recently arrived in the area and were both too practical to pretend we didn't need people to talk to. He was a retired civil engineer, patient in the way of a man who had spent a career building things with intolerance and understood that results outlasted style. He was the kind of man I had trusted completely for 30 years. I want to say that clearly before I tell you the rest of this, because what I am about to describe reflects nothing poorly about him. Somewhere on the back nine, I asked him casually whether he had spent much time with Marcus in the months before the wedding. I framed it as passing curiosity. I had never heard Ted's impression of him, and I was interested. Ted is a direct man. He answered directly. Marcus had begun appearing at the club around March of 2021. Ted said roughly 6 months before the wedding. He came in on Tuesday evenings, occasionally with someone he described as a development contact, more often alone. He was the kind of person who moved through a room with a low-key confidence that made people comfortable without calling attention to itself. He bought drinks when it was his turn, and sometimes when it wasn't. He asked about the area, about people's histories in it, about the community. He had asked about Frank specifically. Several times Ted said across different conversations over different weeks. Casually, naturally, the interested inquiry of a man trying to understand the father of the woman he was serious about. Ted had told him what he knew from 30 years of Tuesday golf, that Frank valued privacy above most things, that he drove an older car and lived without visible markers of anything exceptional, that in 3 decades of friendship, he had never once raised money as a topic of conversation, which Ted had always taken as the habit of a man who was comfortable and didn't need to perform it. I sat in the cart and let Ted describe without understanding that he was doing so the exact profile of a man who would appear to carry modest savings and a federal pension. Discreet, unassuming, invisible. Every piece of that picture was accurate. Every conclusion drawn from it was wrong. Lifestyle and net worth are not the same ledger. Marcus had analyzed the first and applied the results to the second, without recognizing they were separate documents. At some point in the conversation, Ted mentioned his daughter, Lena. He said she did financial and forensic work for a few estate attorneys around the area. He said it the way parents mention their children's work, with a contained pride that didn't ask for a reaction. I already knew that name. I had known it for 3 months, from signed documents and work summaries in Audrey's office. What I had not known until Ted said it in a golf cart in June was that the Lena who had arrived at Audrey's with 3 banker's boxes and a methodical impatience was the same person as Ted Kowalski's daughter. Audrey had never offered the information, and I had never asked. The surname was on the documents. I had simply not connected it. I sat with that for a moment before we reached the next tee. Ted slowed the cart and looked at me. I recognized the expression, the specific look of a person who has been talking freely and is now reassessing what he has been saying. "Frank, I was just making conversation," he said. He seemed genuinely curious. "I thought he was trying to understand you better before the wedding. That's all it looked like." I waited before answering, not because I didn't know what to say, but because I wanted to say it precisely. "I know that, Ted," I said. "You did nothing wrong. I need you to hear this clearly, whatever you told him about how I live. He has been working with that information for 3 months, and it has not changed the outcome of anything. Nothing you said affects how this ends." He was quiet for a few seconds. Ted is not a man who accepts reassurance lightly, but he understood that I was not softening a difficult truth. I was giving him a specific one. After the round, I walked to the parking lot and called Lena before I started the engine. I told her what Ted had described: the Tuesday appearances, the targeted questions, the months of quiet information gathering about a specific family. She was quiet for a moment. Then, "He profiled the family through the social network before he proposed. That's not instinct. That is a methodology. He collected what he needed before he committed." "That's my read," I said. "And you know whose daughter you are now that I think about it." A pause. "My father told you just now." She said, "Good. That actually shifts something I've been working on about the Arizona connection. I'll send you something before the end of the week." I told her I would look for it and ended the call. I took out the notebook before I started the car. One entry, June 14th, 2022. Confirmed Marcus conducted targeted social profiling of the Donnelly family through T. Kowalski, beginning approximately March 2021, 6 months prior to the wedding. Pre-proposal intelligence gathering, deliberate, structured, That was a specific kind of planning. Not a man who, in the course of becoming serious about Claire, happened to pay attention to what her family might be worth. A man who had completed the profile before he decided to proceed. The proposal came after the assessment was finished. I sat in the parking lot longer than I needed to. A man who builds a methodology for profiling families through social relationships, then refines it across multiple applications, is a man who has done this before. The Arizona question Lena had referenced the record that existed in a small Tucson county with incomplete digital indexing was beginning to take a shape I recognized. I needed to give that shape a name. What had begun in September of 2021 as fewer calls and shorter messages had shifted through one winter and into the following summer into something harder to name. By July of 2022, the narrowing was complete. I want to tell you what that actually looks like from the inside, because I think people misunderstand it. They assume it is dramatic, sharp edges, a specific confrontation, the kind of event you can point to and say that is when it happened. What it looked like was ordinary days, one after another in sequence without resolution. That is the part that is hardest to explain to someone who hasn't lived inside it. The person was still alive. She was in the world 40 minutes from Harlow Ridge, going to work and eating meals and living inside a life I had been inside exactly 3 times. She was not gone. She was unreachable, which is a different thing entirely, and in many ways a more difficult one. A loss with a clear ending eventually offers you a shape you can accommodate, a form of grief that has a direction. An absence that is complete but not permanent. A door that is closed, but is somewhere still. A door does not offer that clarity. It asks you to hold the possibility of something you cannot access. That is the specific quality of what the following 10 months required. I sent 3 cards that year, as I had decided I would in November of 2021. The first went out in early August, her birthday. I wrote about a walk I had taken around the eastern edge of Harlow Ridge, about the way the late July light sits on the foothills before the afternoon clouds move in. Nothing about her situation. Nothing that required a response. Nothing that created an obligation she would have to manage. At the bottom of the card, in my own handwriting, I am here. That has not changed. The October card was the hardest to write. I wrote it at the desk in the reading room, Patricia's reading room, on the 14th, the anniversary of her death. I was aware, sitting there, that Patricia had died, not knowing this would happen to her daughter. There had been something in that particular unknowing that I had at difficult moments across the year almost envied. She had loved Claire without the information I now carried. I wrote the card regardless. Same closing line. In mid-December, I wrote the Christmas card at the kitchen table, sealed it, and mailed it the following morning. But I stood at the mailbox in the December cold for a full 2 minutes before I put it in. The envelope was in my hand. The street was empty. And the question I could not answer was the same one it had always been, whether these cards were being received by Claire or removed from view before they reached her. I had no way to know. I put the card in and walked back inside, because that was the one part of this I could still control without anyone's permission. My days had taken on a consistency I did not choose but accepted. Coffee at 6:30. The garden, which I continued to maintain with the limited competence of a man who has learned which things need to happen in which month, but not much beyond that. Tuesday golf with Ted. The contact log updated when there was material to update. Reading in the evenings. Routine, because routine is what a person can sustain when everything else requires uncertainty. Daniel called every Tuesday. What changed in the late summer was the content of those calls. He told me about the email account, a shared login they had established years earlier for coordinating birthday gifts and family surprises, running through an old platform neither of them had used publicly in a decade. Claire accessed it from a laptop she kept in her work studio, a machine Marcus had no reason to examine because she maintained it was restricted to client work, requiring professional confidentiality. It was that. It was also a channel that no one had thought to close. "She's okay," Daniel said one September evening. "She sent something this week. Said she's asking questions about some things. She didn't say what about." "That's all she said," I asked. That's it. Just that she's okay and she's asking questions." I sat with that. A person who says they are asking questions has found something that does not yet have a satisfactory answer, and has decided the answer matters enough to pursue. That was not nothing. That was in fact the beginning of something. I want to be clear about one thing before I continue. The 10 months between July of 2022 and the spring of 2023 were not months during which I felt nothing. I felt the weight of October cards, written in a room where a woman I had been married to for 31 years used to read. I felt the particular cost of holding a discipline steady across time, when discipline becomes heavier with repetition, not lighter. I felt what a father feels when the only available action is continued presence at a correct distance, when the instinct is to go closer, and the understanding is that going closer would make things worse. None of that was abstract. All of it was daily. I simply understood from a long working life, of moving only when the documentation was in order, that acting before I could act effectively was not the same as acting. I had spent decades learning the difference between doing something and doing the right thing. That difference does not become easier to maintain when the person you are waiting for is your daughter. It becomes harder every week. That is the actual content of what 10 months looks like. In February of 2023, Daniel called on a Sunday morning. Not the usual Tuesday evening. Calls from Daniel on a Sunday had come over several years to mean that something had shifted. "She sent something this morning," he said, "on the old account." "What did she say?" "Oh, she said, 'I'm okay. I'm working something out. Don't tell Dad yet.'" I sat with the word. "Yet," I said. "Yeah," Daniel said quietly. "I noticed that too. A person who says not yet has decided in some part of themselves that there will be a when. The word is not 'don't tell Dad.' It is 'don't tell Dad yet.' That single syllable carried an entire direction, a timeline that existed in her mind, even if I could not see its shape. She was working something out. She had decided there would be a moment to say so. I thanked Daniel and told him to let me know if anything more came through. I ended the call and sat for a while. Then I made one call the following Monday morning. Before I tell you what Victor Cass found in Arizona, inside those 3 banker's boxes, in a courthouse, that almost nobody thinks to check, comment the word pattern below. If you've been listening carefully, you already know why that word is about to matter more than anything else in this story. A quick note, parts of this story include fictional elements built for illustration and reflection. Any resemblance to specific names or places is coincidental, but what it points toward is worth your full attention. In February of 2023, 2 days after Daniel's Sunday morning call, I picked up the phone and called a man named Victor Cass. Victor had spent 14 years as a state investigator before the institutional pace of government work and the professional freedom of private practice reached the point where the comparison became straightforward. I had worked alongside him on 2 separate contract fraud matters during my final years at the department, close enough and long enough to understand how he operated, which was with a particular combination of patience and precision I recognized and trusted. I gave him what I had: Marcus David Webb, full name, date of birth from the marriage license paperwork I had kept in the folder with the email and the notebook. Then I said, "I want the complete history, Victor. Start in Arizona." He told me he would be in touch. 5 months passed. Victor sent partial reports at intervals, not full conclusions, but confirmed fragments of detail that allowed me to track the shape of what he was finding without having the complete picture yet. I did not press for speed. My assets had been protected since March of the previous year. I was not operating under a deadline. I was constructing a record. In July of 2023, Victor came to the house on a weekday morning and placed a folder on the kitchen table. He sat briefly while I reviewed the first page, then said, "The Arizona piece is the piece, Frank. That's where it starts, and that's where it's clearest." He left shortly after. I read the remaining pages alone. Marcus David Webb, born Flagstaff, Arizona in 1986. No criminal record. No charges, no convictions, no civil judgments on file in any state where he had maintained residence. Employed in commercial real estate development across Arizona and Colorado over 15 years. His financial history showed a pattern of projects initiated with aggressive leverage that had, in several instances, required capital infusions that did not materialize as projected. Previously married to Renata Isabel Cruz in Tucson, Pima County, Arizona. The marriage lasted from August of 2015 to March of 2018. 29 months. Renata was 31 years old at the time of the divorce. Her father, Dr. Eduardo Cruz, was a retired vascular surgeon whose retirement from a multi-decade practice had been announced in the relevant medical community publications in the fall of 2014. His estate at the time of retirement was substantial and had not been organized behind any legal protection structures. The timing of Marcus's introduction into Renata's life, 7 months after her father's retirement. What followed was a specific sequence. A small, curated wedding, 42 guests, 11 on Marcus's side. A period of progressive social narrowing that, based on accounts Victor had located, through a combination of public records and a direct conversation with a person who had been in contact with Renata during the marriage, resulted in her becoming substantially isolated from her family within the first year. Then, in the third year, Marcus initiated the divorce. During the course of the marriage, Dr. Cruz had transferred approximately $760,000 into a joint checking account held by Marcus and Renata, structured as gifts to them as a couple for the household, for their shared future. Under Arizona's community property statute, funds deposited into a joint marital account are considered community property regardless of their external origin. The account carried no separate property designation, no trust structure, no documentation that might have established the funds as belonging to one spouse. Dr. Cruz had not known to build those protections. He had trusted the arrangement to be what it appeared to be. When the divorce finalized, Marcus received half of the account's balance, $380,000, legally obtained under the applicable statute. Documented in the county court's dissolution record, I set the pages down. There had been a father in Tucson who had not been prepared. That was the sentence I sat with, not as an abstraction about legal structure or financial planning, but as a fact about a specific man who had watched something happen to his daughter and had not had what he needed to prevent it. Dr. Cruz had given his daughter's household money in good faith and had not understood that without the correct structure, good faith is not protection. Marcus had understood the gap between good faith and structure. It was I recognized exactly the same gap he had identified in this family's finances. The gap that no longer existed. Victor's notes at the end of the report were concise. This does not appear to be opportunistic. This appears to be a practiced methodology that has been refined across at least 2 iterations. Subject demonstrates awareness of limitations encountered in the prior instance and has made deliberate adjustments in the subsequent approach. I read that paragraph 3 times. I had thought, during much of the preceding 2 years, that Marcus had identified me specifically, my background, my professional history, something particular to this family that had made it a target. Victor's report clarified this. He had not chosen this family. He had chosen families with a certain profile, a recently retired father, private in his financial habits, with a daughter at the right stage of her life, who had the combination of qualities that made her both valuable and vulnerable to a particular kind of sustained attention. He had researched this family to confirm it fit the category. The selection came first. The confirmation came second. That distinction required me to sit with something I had not fully anticipated. There was a woman in Arizona who had lived through an earlier version of what was unfolding here. A less refined version, one that had required adjustments for the second attempt. That thought arrived with a cold, settled quality of anger that had no outward expression and nowhere particular to go. I did not raise my voice. I did not require anyone to witness it. It was the anger of a man who has confirmed something and is now absolutely clear about what he is dealing with. I called Audrey. I went through the report's key findings. She listened without interruption and then said, "This changes the context significantly, Frank. If any part of this reaches a legal proceeding, this is not an isolated incident. It is a documented pattern with a prior instance. Courts look at pattern evidence differently than they look at a single case." I know, I said. "So good," she said. "Keep that report in a secure location." I thanked her and put the phone down. I thought about what Daniel had told me months earlier. Claire was asking questions carefully about specific aspects of Marcus's business activity. She hadn't said what she'd found. But careful people who become careful about something specific have generally found something worth being careful about. I thought about the letter in my desk drawer, the sentence Patricia had not been able to finish, and I thought about what it means when a woman who carries both steadiness and the capacity to open completely finally stops opening. It means she has found the door. I want to describe what the weeks following Victor's report actually looked like, because they are easy to misread as inaction. They were not inaction. They were the most deliberate work I did in the entire span of this story. The kind of deliberate that does not produce visible output. The kind of careful that leaves no record except for a single journal entry that I wrote to hold myself accountable to a decision that was harder to maintain than any decision I made that had a clear forward step. The week after I received the report, I sat at the desk in the reading room with a blank page and mapped out what I understood to be the two available paths. The way I would have mapped competing approaches in a complex audit engagement, where the wrong choice of methodology would invalidate everything that followed. The first path, I approach Claire directly. I tell her what I know. I show her the report, the Renata Cruz case, the Arizona divorce, the methodology Victor had documented. I give her the full picture and let her draw her own conclusions from it. The problem with this path was not the information. The information was accurate, documented, and significant. The problem was the sequence it would set in motion. Marcus would find out, because information shared with a compromised line reaches the person controlling that line. He would know that I had commissioned a private investigation, that I had been building a record, that the asymmetry between what he believed I knew and what I actually knew, an asymmetry that had existed for nearly 2 years, was gone. A man who knows he has been investigated and is running against a financial deadline does not wait. He accelerates. He creates complications before the situation can become organized against him. I would lose the one structural advantage I had been holding without his knowledge. The second path, I continue to do nothing visible and allow Claire to reach her own conclusions through whatever process she was already engaged in. This path had its own cost. She was inside a situation with information I possessed, and she did not. There was something in that particular imbalance that required me to examine my own reasoning carefully to make certain I was making a strategic decision and not a comfortable one. The distinction was important. I called Audrey and presented both paths without stating which one I was inclined toward. She said, "Right now, he doesn't know what you're holding. That asymmetry is one of the most valuable things you have. If you give Claire the report, and Marcus finds out, and he will find out, he knows you've been investigating him. He could accelerate or complicate things in ways that become very difficult to manage from a distance. He knows how to create conditions that are hard to untangle." "And if Claire finds it herself?" I asked. "Then she found it herself," Audrey said. He can't argue father's interference when the source is her own investigation. Whatever she decides to do with it, she decided. That's a completely different legal and personal position than her father told her. The strength of that position is significant. I thought about this for a long time before I said anything. 3 months, I said. If nothing has changed by November, I'll reconsider. That's reasonable, she said. After the call, I went back to the reading room and wrote in the journal for the first time in a way that was not purely observational. Not a contact log entry. Not a documentation of fact. A statement of reasoning and conditions why I was choosing this. What I was accepting by choosing it. And exactly what circumstances would cause me to reverse the decision. I dated it, signed it the way I sign official documents, and put it in the folder with the report and the email and the notebook. It was in the most literal sense I could apply a contract with myself, because the decision to hold significant information while someone you love remains in the situation that makes the information relevant is not a passive choice. It requires continued active maintenance. It gets heavier every time the phone does not ring. That was the work of the weeks following Victor's report. Not acting. Choosing specifically not to act for reasons that I had documented completely under conditions I had defined clearly. Renewable after 90 days. I had spent 28 years understanding the difference between an unmade decision and a made one. This was a made one. In early August, Daniel called. Claire had sent another message through the old account. He read it to me the way he had learned to read these messages, precisely without editorializing, with the awareness that I would want the exact language. She said, "I'm okay, working something out. Don't tell Dad yet." I listened to those words with a different quality of understanding than I had brought to them in February. 6 months earlier, the word yet had told me that a direction existed. In August, knowing what I knew from Victor's report, knowing what Claire had apparently been examining about Marcus's business activity, I understood that the direction was not hypothetical. She was moving. The yet was a timeline that existed in her mind and was getting shorter. She was protecting me from a conversation she was not ready to have while arriving steadily at the point where she would be. "She knows something," I said to Daniel. That's what I thought," he said. "She sounds different. The message sounds different." He was right about that. The February message had been the message of a person who had found something requiring investigation. The August message was the message of a person who had finished the investigation and was now working out what to do with what it had produced. That is a different quality of stillness. Not the stillness of not knowing, but the stillness that comes immediately before a person makes a decision they have already made. I told Daniel to continue with what he was doing and to let me know if she sent anything further. I thanked him and put the phone down. I picked up the journal and did not write anything new. What was already written was sufficient. 11 days later, on a Thursday evening in the second week of August, my phone lit up with her name on the screen. Not a message. Not an email through the old account. A direct call. Claire had not called me on an ordinary weekday evening at 11 o'clock at night in more than a year and a half. I set down what I was holding. I sat up straight, and I answered before the second ring had finished. I will tell you about that call as precisely as I can remember it, because it deserves precision, not drama. It was a phone call between two people who understood each other, and what made it what it was had nothing to do with the volume or the emotion. It had to do with the specific quality of honesty two people can produce when they have each in their own way. Been working toward the same understanding for a long time without comparing notes. I said her name when I answered. That was all. After that, I listened. 28 years of receiving investigative reports had taught me one absolute rule: you do not interrupt a witness who is recounting their testimony. Not for clarification, not for reassurance, not for any reason that serves the listener more than it serves the speaker. You let the account complete itself in the sequence it wants to take without imposing a different shape on it. Claire had called at 11 o'clock at night, with something she had needed to say for a long time. I was not going to put any shape on it except her own. What she had found began with a charge in the joint bank account. A legal consulting fee, she said, appearing regularly from the second week of the marriage, billed by a firm whose name did not correspond to any vendor in Marcus's active real estate project files, which she had quietly cross-referenced over several weeks. A firm she had not heard him mention, doing work she had not been told about, paid from the account they shared. She had traced the firm. It was registered in Arizona. The attorney on record had handled dissolution proceedings in Pima County. She searched those proceedings specifically, not Marcus's name in general, which had produced nothing on previous general searches, but the attorney's caseload and the year range she calculated based on the billing start date. Through a paid court record service, she located a 2017 dissolution filing, Marcus David Webb, petitioner, and the respondent, Renata Isabel Cruz. She had taken 2 days with that information before she said anything to him. She had spent those 2 days confirming what she had found, making certain of what she was holding before she introduced it into a conversation she could not take back. The confrontation had been the previous evening. She told me he had denied it at first, a flat, immediate denial delivered with the specific steadiness of someone who had prepared a response for exactly this possibility. Then, when she showed him the documents she had pulled, the denial shifted into minimization. It was a long time ago. It was complicated. It had not been relevant to who he was now. When she did not accept the minimization, he shifted again. He looked at me, she said, and he said, "Be very careful about what you think you know, Claire." Not a question, a warning. She had recorded the entire conversation on the phone in her jacket pocket. She said without a particular emphasis on it, "I don't know if that was legal. I just did it." I told her that in Colorado, one person in a recorded conversation is sufficient consent, and that person can be the one doing the recording. She said she had not known that. I said it did not surprise me that she had done it regardless. Then she asked me the question I had known was coming since the moment I saw her name on the screen. "Dad," a pause. "Did you know about this?" I had thought about how to answer this question many times since July. I gave her the only answer that was available to me, which was the complete one. "I found out in July," when I said. "I made the decision not to bring it to you because I needed you to reach it yourself under your own conditions through your own process. I believed that if the information came from me, it would carry a different weight than if you found it yourself. And that difference in weight would matter when you decided what to do with it. I was wrong to be silent without telling you why I was being silent. I'm sorry for that." The line was quiet for a moment, long enough that I could hear the specific quality of it, the quiet of someone absorbing something, not rejecting it. "No," she said. "If you had brought it to me, I would have defended him. I know exactly how that conversation would have gone and where it would have ended up. I needed to be the one who found it." You were right about that, even if the silence was hard. I told her to call a lawyer in the morning, her own, independent of anyone I might suggest, someone she chose for herself. She said she had already found a name and had an appointment scheduled for Monday. That answer arrived the way several of Claire's answers had arrived over the years, practical, a step ahead, already solved before the advice landed. I said, "When you're ready, only when you want to, I'd like you to call Audrey Sims." "Why Audrey?" she asked. "Because she's been prepared for this since the beginning of 2022, I said. "And Claire, you are not starting from behind in this. I need you to understand that." She was quiet again. Then she said, "He chose us specifically, didn't he? Not just me, the whole family. He did research." "Yes," I said. She sat with that for several seconds. When she spoke again, her voice had the specific quality I remembered from the first time I had watched her deal with something that required steadiness. The quality I had always recognized as her mother's, arriving in a different register. "Good," she said. Then whatever happens next, I want it to be exactly what he never planned for. We talked until close to 1 in the morning. Not about strategy, there would be time for that, but about what the previous 2 years had looked like from her side of it. The things she had understood and the things she had not understood until recently. The specific details of a life being slowly narrowed, that she had begun to document herself in her own way, without knowing that I had a contact log of my own. We compared our timelines. They aligned with a precision that would have been remarkable if either of us had been surprised by it. When we ended the call, I sat in the kitchen in the dark for a long time. I thought about the letter in the desk drawer, the words Patricia had written about steadiness and openness, and what the combination of those two things required in the person who deserved them. I thought about the decision I had made in August to hold my silence, and the decision Claire had made in August to break hers. And I thought the right moment to say something is sometimes, finally, the moment you say nothing. I had trusted our daughter to find it. Patricia had always known that would be the correct choice. She had understood Claire in a way that I was still. 3 years after losing her learning to match, what happened in the weeks following that call? I know partly from what Claire told me directly, partly from what Audrey's office reported, and partly from 2 voicemails that arrived on my personal line without invitation. I want to be clear throughout this section about which information comes from which source. Some of what I'm about to describe, I witnessed. Some of it I was told afterward, and I am going to say so plainly rather than presenting it as though I had been in rooms I was not in. That distinction has mattered to me throughout this entire account, and I am not going to stop honoring it now. What Claire told me she had called an attorney. The Monday after our late-night conversation, someone reached through a referral from Audrey's network, handling family law independently, with no connection to any of the overlapping relationships in this situation. She told me she walked into the first meeting with the recording from the confrontation saved on her phone and a folder of printed documentation organized chronologically that she had built herself over the preceding week. She sat down across from that attorney and said, "Here is what I found, here is what I recorded, and here is what I believe it means." The attorney listened for the better part of an hour. The notes she took were not the preliminary kind. They were the kind that mean the person across the table has already decided what they are dealing with. Marcus filed for divorce in the first week of September of 2023. He had retained a firm based in Denver, an attorney named Preston Hale, and the filing carried the specific professional confidence of a man who had assessed his window and decided the moment was correct. Whatever Claire's confrontation 3 weeks earlier had communicated to him, his conclusion was that moving quickly was preferable to waiting. He had a financial deadline. He had a legal theory. He had told Hale exactly what to look for. Claire was not unprepared. She had spent the 2 weeks since the late-night call building a response that did not require her to guess at what was coming, the recording, the documentation, and the attorney she had already retained. When the filing arrived, it arrived into a prepared position, not a surprised one. He had initiated what he believed was his execution. What he was actually initiating was the beginning of its failure. Audrey's office received the filing and Hale's initial correspondence that same week. Audrey handled the correspondence and noted it in the file. He also left 2 voicemails on my personal line. I listened to both before deciding to return neither. The first was controlled, positioned as reasonable concern for the situation, a request to speak, the particular warmth a person deploys when they need something from you. The second came 4 days later when the first had not been returned. The second was not controlled, and it was not positioned as reasonable. I noted the difference logged both in the record for the appropriate date and did not call back. There was nothing he could say to me that would alter the state of the folder in my desk drawer, and everything I needed to communicate to him would be communicated more clearly through the process that was already underway. Daniel drove down the day after the filing and stayed for a week. He settled in with the specific efficiency of someone who does not ask what is needed, because he has already looked at the situation and identified it. He helped Claire organize everything she had gathered: the recordings, the Renata Cruz documentation, the billing records from the joint account, the timeline she had constructed into a formal, chronologically structured document that her attorney could work with as a primary reference. My son built a chronological evidence record that an auditor would have produced with satisfaction. He told me about it afterward in the manner he uses for things he considers self-evident. She needed it organized, so I organized it. He had driven 4 hours and stayed a week, and that is the entirety of what he said about it. I met Claire for coffee at the end of that first week of September. She had chosen a small place in central Harlow Ridge, a corner table near the window that looked out onto the main street. The kind of window that gives you something to look at when you need a moment before you speak. I arrived to find her already there, both hands around her cup, watching the street. When she looked up and saw me come through the door, I understood something the phone had not been able to convey across 14 months of careful distance. She looked like herself, not the version that the previous 2 years had gradually constructed, the careful, managed version that communicated in short, structurally complete sentences. The version underneath that, the one that had been there all along, waiting for the conditions to return to something she recognized. We sat for a while without requiring much to be said. Some reunions don't need words to be what they are. The presence is the thing, and we were both present, and that was, for the first several minutes, entirely sufficient. Then she said, "I feel so stupid." I put down my cup. "You trusted the person you married," I said. "That is what marriage asks of you. It doesn't ask you to investigate. It asks you to trust. Stupid is running in a very different direction from that." She was quiet, looking at the street. "He chose us specifically. He researched us before he even asked me." "Yes," I said. She waited a moment. "Good." She said the way she said it. I recognized that she had arrived at something, not that she was beginning to approach it. "Good," I agreed. She looked at me. "Why good?" "Because a man who prepares carefully for an outcome and then does not find that outcome has a specific problem. One that he did not build into his plan." She turned that over with the particular quality of attention I had watched in her since she was a child. Not rushing, not performing consideration, actually doing it. Then she picked up her coffee and gave a single measured nod. The nod was her mother's. Not the look, the specific quality of what it meant. A thing has been assessed, confirmed, and is now ready to proceed. I drove home that afternoon, knowing what Audrey had told me the previous day. She had mentioned that Preston Hale, Marcus's Denver attorney, had come into the discovery phase with a notable degree of professional confidence about what he expected to locate in the asset documentation. She had noted it in the way Audrey notes things she finds professionally interesting. I had asked her what she meant. "He's confident," she said, "because he believes he understands what he's working with. His client has given him a picture of this family's asset structure, and he's walking into discovery with that picture guiding his strategy." She paused. "He'll have a different understanding before long." By October of 2023, Preston Hale's office had completed its initial review and was beginning the formal discovery phase. Discovery in a divorce proceeding is, in its way, a form of audit, a structured process of requesting documentation in order to establish what exists and what can be claimed. Having spent 28 years on the other side of that kind of structured inquiry, I understood with considerable precision what it feels like to go looking for what you expect to find and encounter instead a wall of documentation you were not prepared to deal with. Hale had entered this case with a workable picture in mind. His client had described the father of the opposing party, a retired federal civil servant, private in his financial habits, living modestly in a mid-sized Colorado community, with what a reasonable inference would suggest was a government pension, some accumulated savings, and a paid-off house. Based on that picture, his discovery strategy had a logical architecture. He would identify the beneficial interest Claire held in the family trust and use it as the entry point for a broader financial inquiry. Audrey sent everything he asked for. The complete trust documentation, the current version, with the amended language that had been in place since January of 2022, the LLC registration records for the Montana timberland, and the logistics partnership, each with formation dates and structure clearly laid out. The restaurant stake documentation, the house title, every asset in full accompanied by its legal structure. She did not resist the disclosure requests. She complied with them precisely and completely, because what the documentation showed was not vulnerability. It was architecture he did not yet have a theory for. Hale reviewed the materials and submitted a subpoena. He sought Frank Donnelly's complete personal financial records, arguing that Claire's position as a named trust beneficiary constituted her as an interested party in the trust's assets, and that therefore her father, as the trust's grantor and sole trustee, was obligated to produce full financial disclosure. The subpoena was on its surface a reasonable procedural attempt. It was built on the same legal theory Marcus had outlined in the email I had read 2 years earlier, that a trust beneficiary's position creates a current beneficial interest that becomes marital property. Audrey contested it. Her response was straightforward. The trust in its current form carried fully discretionary distribution language, with no fixed schedule, no baseline pattern, and no guaranteed right to any payment. A beneficiary of a fully discretionary trust does not hold a vested present interest. She holds a possibility contingent entirely on the trustee's judgment. A contingent possibility is not marital property under Colorado law. Frank Donnelly was a third party to the divorce proceeding and had no obligation to disclose personal financial records on the basis of a theory that had no legal foothold. The judge reviewed the contesting arguments over 3 weeks. The written decision dismissed the subpoena. Audrey read me the key language over the phone. The motion fails to establish sufficient basis for third-party financial disclosure. The phrase sufficient basis appeared twice in 4 sentences. Audrey told me that for that particular judge, with that particular writing style appearing twice in 4 sentences, constituted as emphatic a dismissal as his bench was likely to produce. The following week, Hale called Audrey's office to ask questions about the trust's structure. I was seated across from her desk when the call came in. She put it on speaker. "When were these trust amendments completed?" Hale asked. "January of 2022, Audrey said. A pause. "That's prior to any formal proceedings in this case." "That's correct." Another pause, longer. "Was Mr. Donnelly anticipating legal action in January of 2022? Audrey's expression did not change. She had the specific stillness of someone who has been waiting for a question and has already decided what the answer is. "Mr. Hale," she said. "Frank Donnelly spent 28 years reading government contracts for evidence of intent. He doesn't amend anything without understanding precisely what that amendment protects against." The longest silence of the call. "I see," Hale said. "Thank you, Miss Sims." He ended the call. He did not call again. Audrey looked across the desk at me. "He knows," she said. "What exactly does he know?" I asked. "That the legal theory his client's entire strategy was built on was removed from the equation in January of 2022, 14 months before his client filed anything, before any proceeding existed, before there was any action to respond to." She set down her pen. "He can't argue bad faith. He can't argue anticipatory transfer. The timing is clean and the documentation is thorough. He knows that when he goes back to his client and explains where the case stands, he's going to be explaining that the foundation of the plan was neutralized before the plan had any opportunity to be executed." I sat with that for a moment. Then I thanked Audrey and drove home. That evening, Lena called. She had been monitoring Marcus's project financials as a professional habit since the summer, she said, and the picture had continued to clarify. The third-quarter deadline on both commercial projects had passed without the capital position his lenders required. The extension terms he had negotiated were conditional, tighter collateral requirements, accelerated repayment schedules, lender oversight provisions that signaled the other parties in those agreements no longer trusted the projections they had been given. The math on both projects, she said, was no longer holding. I thanked her and put the phone down. I thought about what it means when a structure is built on a calculation that was wrong from the beginning. In engineering, the load-bearing assumptions must be correct before anything is built on top of them. Change the assumptions and every element above them, every beam, every joint, every carefully assembled component is suddenly performing calculations it was never designed to perform. The foundation does not announce the error. The structure above it discovers it, usually all at once. What followed was 14 months of legal procedure. I am going to spare you the week-by-week account of that process, because the outcome is less interesting than the shape of what led to it, and because the meaningful part of this story had already been decided in a series of rooms and phone calls and kitchen table evenings that you have already heard about. What happened between January of 2024 and February of 2025 was the confirmation of conclusions that had been structurally determined in January of 2022. The proceedings simply took 14 months to complete the confirmation. Discovery finished by March of 2024. Hale had been thorough and careful and had arrived at the end of that process at what the documentation showed with precision. Claire's professional income from her architectural practice, the joint checking account they had maintained during the marriage, and one vehicle. Those were the marital assets. That was what existed in the shared sphere of that marriage. The estate that Marcus had spent 2 years profiling and 18 months legally pursuing was not present in any form that a Colorado court could treat as accessible to the proceeding. Not the timberland, not the restaurant stake, not the trust, not the distributions, not the LLCs, none of it. It had never been present in a form accessible to this proceeding. It had simply taken 14 months of discovery to arrive at the documentation of that absence. Marcus made one final effort in the late summer of 2024. He instructed Hale to argue that the absence of trust distributions since January of 2022 was itself relevant, that the court should consider what Claire had historically received from the trust as a factor in calculating any potential alimony obligation. It was a reduced version of the original theory filed by a legal team that had run out of the larger argument and was now working with what remained of it. Audrey's response was brief. The distributions had been fully discretionary. At all times had ceased in January of 2022 as a matter of the grantor's judgment and had not resumed. There was no historical income stream to calculate. Because there was no guaranteed stream, there had never been a guaranteed stream. And the amended trust language established this clearly with 2 years of documented history to support it. The motion was denied in September of 2024. By November of 2024, the remaining negotiations had concluded. The settlement assigned Claire's professional accounts, her share of the joint assets, and the vehicle. Marcus received what the marital estate could honestly provide him, which was considerably less than the number he had organized his financial plans around. The projects in District 4 of Harlow Ridge had been restructured under lender oversight. The terms of that restructuring were not by any reasonable measure favorable. He had arrived at February of 2025, carrying obligations that had grown, while the settlement he had anticipated to resolve them had not materialized. The call came from Audrey on the morning of February 6th. It was 10 o'clock. She told me the dissolution had been finalized and entered into the record. "Thank you, Audrey," I said, "for all of it. From the beginning." She said she would send the final paperwork to the P.O. box. I thanked her again and ended the call. I poured a fresh cup of coffee. Not the reheated version I sometimes settle for in the middle of the morning, a fresh pot brewed from the beginning. I sat down at the kitchen table, Through the window, Patricia's garden was in its February state, the bare framework of what would come back, the structural shapes of things that were not dead, only waiting for the conditions to return. I had maintained that garden across 6 winters now. I knew which things came back reliably, and which ones needed attention in March to make it through to May. I had learned both. I sat there for a while. Then I called Daniel. He answered on the first ring. He had been waiting. "It's done," I said. A pause. The specific quality of a pause from someone absorbing something they have known was coming and still needed a moment to receive. "How are you feeling, Dad?" I looked out at the garden. "I'm sitting in the kitchen looking at the garden," I said. "Yeah," Daniel said. That was sufficient. After a moment, he said, "Dad, Claire wants to come by the house." I did not need to think about that. "She can always come home," I said. That part hasn't changed. He was quiet again. Then, I know. She knows that too. She just needed to hear it said out loud today. "Tell her," I said, "that the coffee will be on." What had been completed on the morning of February 6th was exactly what I had set out to complete on the morning of November 15th of 2021. When I had walked into Audrey's office on the 3rd floor of the Brixton building with a printed email and a spiral notebook and a contact log, every asset I had built across 24 years was intact. The trust had been amended, and the amendment had held. The LLCs had been structured, and the structures had been clean. The subpoena had been contested and dismissed. The final motion had been denied. Not one element of what Marcus Webb had spent 2.5 years building a strategy around had been available to him when he finally went looking for it. This was not luck. It was not a favorable judge or a fortuitous legal interpretation. It was the result of moving early, moving correctly, and building structures that were sound enough to withstand the weight they were designed to carry. 28 years of audit work had taught me one principle above all others. The time to address a vulnerability is before it is exploited, not during. A man who waits until the problem is active has already lost ground he cannot recover. I sat at the kitchen table after the call with Daniel and let the morning go quiet. The February light came through the window in the thin, pale way of late winter Colorado, the kind of light that carries no warmth, but is honest about what it is and what is coming. I thought about a man in Denver who had missed a deadline and received a settlement that had not addressed the problem the settlement was intended to solve. I thought about structures built on calculations that were wrong at the foundation. I poured a second cup of coffee and sat with it, and I waited for whatever came next without urgency, without any particular name for what it was, simply waiting. In Colorado, summer storms arrive the way important things tend to, without prior announcement all at once, and then simply there, moving through everything. You can watch one build over the Rockies in the morning, and within 40 minutes it is overhead, applying itself to whatever is directly below it, with complete indifference to what you had planned for the afternoon. The Wednesday in July of 2025 had started as a clear morning. I had taken coffee in the garden, done some work at the desk, and thought about the section of Patricia's garden on the eastern side that had been pulling my attention for the better part of the week. Daniel was coming the following Tuesday, the kind of ordinary day that July can produce in Colorado when it decides to behave itself. I heard the gravel on the drive just after 2 o'clock. Through the kitchen window, I watched a car I recognized come to a stop behind mine. Claire got out. She had not called ahead. She was not carrying anything, no bag, no jacket. She had stepped out of the car in what had clearly been sunshine, and she was standing on the front path when the first serious rain of the storm came down on all of it at once. She did not run for the door. She stood in it for a moment, the way a person stands when the external situation corresponds fairly accurately to the internal one. I opened the front door before she reached the steps. She was on the porch, her hair wet through water running off her jacket. She looked at me and said, "I need you to know I'm sorry, Dad." I pushed the door open wider. "Come in," I said. Coffee's already made. No summary of the lessons involved. No accounting of what had been known and when. No statement of having been right about anything. Just the door opened wider and the coffee already made. She came inside. The kitchen had the specific quality of a room in which rain can be heard against every surface, the windows, the roof, the garden outside. We sat at the table with the cups between us, and the storm conducting itself against the glass. And I was aware that I was sitting across from my daughter for the first time in 2 years in a context that did not carry the managed, carefully structured quality of the coffee shop meeting or the phone call at 11. She was wearing wet clothes at my kitchen table in the middle of a Wednesday afternoon, and neither of us had prepared anything to say. And that was the appropriate condition for what this conversation was. She said, "I believed him, Dad, when he said you were pulling us apart, that you were too involved in my life, and you needed to let me make my own choices. I believed him because I needed the marriage to work, and I thought that was what needing a marriage to work felt like. Like you had to choose." She paused. "I chose wrong." I said, "You did what you had to do. The person who was wrong about the direction they were supposed to be going in isn't you." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "How long were you waiting?" "I wasn't waiting," I said. "I was here. There's a difference between those two things." She looked at her cup. "I got all the cards," she said. "Every card, every year. He read them. He never said a word about them. Never told me to throw them away, never made it into anything. I kept them in the drawer by my bed." She looked up. "All of them." Marcus had read the cards and left them where they were, because they were not threatening enough to justify removing, and removing them would have required an explanation. A card from a father to his daughter, closing with the same line each time, does not carry the visible content of a threat. It carries the invisible content of a presence that continued regardless, and that is only visible when you are looking for it. She had been looking for it in the drawer by her bed. Each time he had been unavailable for comment on what was happening inside that marriage. After a while, Claire looked through the window at the garden. The rain had softened from the first hard burst to the steady middle portion that Colorado storms settle into. "Mom's garden," she said. "Yes," I said. She looked at it. "It's a mess." "And parts of it," I said. "Not all of it." We got up and went out into it. Not because we had decided to do so, but because the garden was there, and it needed attention, and we were both capable of giving it some. We worked without talking. She found the eastern border where the growth had gotten ahead of itself and started pulling what didn't belong. I worked alongside her with the hand fork. We had done this kind of work, or work like it, for her entire life, and the silence of two people doing physical work together in a familiar place is not an empty silence. It has weight and texture and requires nothing to fill it. Under a dense patch she had cleared, she stopped. She reached down and touched the stem of something close to the ground, one of Patricia's peonies. 3 years under varying degrees of neglect. 3 Colorado winters and the root structure intact, and working beneath the soil the whole time. Neither of us said anything for a while. Then she said, "Mom would have found this funny. The whole way it ended. I thought about that." "She had a very precise sense of humor," I said. "She found things funny that most people would have found either too subtle or too devastating. She was very accurate about it." The second wave of rain moved us inside. Claire stayed for dinner, whatever was available, which was enough. We talked about Daniel's visit, about a project she had been offered in Denver, about which side of the garden needed the most work before autumn. After dinner, she washed the dishes. I dried them and put them away. We had done this in this kitchen since she was 12 years old. There are things, it turns out, that are considerably more durable than the things that attempt to interrupt them. 3 months after the evening Claire and I spent working in the garden in the rain, Daniel mentioned something during a regular Tuesday call, almost as an aside, in the way that you note something, when the information is real but its weight is self-evident enough not to require presentation. He had been keeping an occasional eye on the District 4 development filings, he said, as a residual habit from the timeline document he had built for Claire's attorney. Marcus Webb's company name had appeared in the business filings that week. Have both projects? I asked. Both of them, he said. Filed for bankruptcy protection. The company is listed as closed. Thank you for telling me, Daniel. I put the phone down. I poured a cup of coffee. I looked out at the garden. That was the full extent of what the information required from me. Not because it was small. It was not small, but because it had the quality of a conclusion that had been visible since February of 2023, when Lena had told me that the math on both projects had stopped holding. A structure built on a faulty foundation does not require a dramatic announcement when it reaches the point of collapse. The collapse is the arithmetic completing itself. The calculation was wrong when it was made. The result was always going to be this one. Now it was. I thought, as I stood at the counter with the coffee, about what it means to plan around an asset that turned out not to exist. Not hidden, not restructured around. Not protected from reach, simply not present in the form the plan required. A man who maps a territory from second-hand information and builds his strategy around that map does not fail in any particular decisive moment. He fails the moment he accepts the inventory without verifying it himself. That failure precedes everything else. The bankruptcy filing is not the event. It is the paperwork completing the record of an event that occurred much earlier. The garden in October is the particular garden of a season winding toward its conclusions, the plants doing their end-of-year accounting, making whatever decisions they make about what to carry forward. Patricia's peonies had done a full season's growth since July. They were back, not the way they had been under her hands in the years before she died, that will require more time, but alive in a way that does not require argument. Committed to continuing. 2 weeks before, Claire had come by on a Saturday, and we had planted lavender along the south border, where Claire said her mother had once remarked it should go. She had heard Patricia say that when she was 12 years old and had not forgotten it. We planted it. We worked for most of the afternoon. Neither of us said very much while we were doing it, and neither of us needed to. Patricia had a way of talking about the garden that was rarely only about the garden. She would be on her knees in the spring with the trowel, and she would say without particular emphasis, "Why, nothing grows from what you put into it in a single season. It grows from all the years of it, the springs when you tend it and see nothing happen. The winters when everything above the ground looks completely finished." She was describing soil composition and root development and the season-on-season accumulation of the conditions that make sustained growth possible. She was also describing everything else. She had that quality. She could say the precise true thing about what was directly in front of her, and at the same moment about everything that resembled it. Before I close this account, I want to say clearly what it has been about. It has not been about $7.27 million, though that number was real, and the structures I built to protect it were real, and the 24 years that produced both of those things were real. It has not been about the trust amendments Audrey drafted, or the LLCs she registered, or the subpoena that was dismissed with the phrase "insufficient basis" appearing twice in 4 sentences. It has not been about the email sent to the wrong address by 2 letters, or the notebook with 11 questions written in the second kitchen drawer in November of 2019, or the contact log I maintained through 10 months of managed silence, or Victor Cass's report on a man who had done this before and had refined his approach for the second attempt. Those were tools. They were the correct tools used at the correct time for the correct purpose. I would use them again under the same circumstances without hesitation. But tools are not the story. Tools are how you protect the story. The most valuable thing a person builds does not appear on any document, any account statement, or any legal filing in any county in any state. It has no assessed value No tax basis. No structure that can be amended or challenged or reached by subpoena. It cannot be characterized as a current beneficial interest or a marital asset or a present vested claim in any proceeding before any court. The most motivated attorney working from the most thorough inventory cannot locate it because it does not exist in a form that legal processes are designed to locate. It is what was standing on the front porch in July, a woman in a Colorado rainstorm who had not called ahead because some conversations cannot be arranged in advance, saying she needed me to know she was sorry before the door was fully open. It is what was at the kitchen sink after dinner, doing what we have done in this kitchen since she was 12 years old. It is the peonies in the garden that held through 3 winters when the attention they received was less than they deserved, and came back this year in full. It is the lavender we planted last month in the place her mother always said it should go. It is the cards in the drawer of a bedside table in a house she no longer lives in, 3 cards a year. Same closing line each time kept where she could reach them. That is the asset that does not appear on any disclosure form. That is the thing the notebook and the trust amendments and the 14 months of legal proceedings were built to protect. All of it. The documentation, the structure, the strategy. The patience was a wall built around something that cannot be assessed and cannot be filed and cannot be claimed by anyone who was not already there. I am 60 years old. I live in a house in Harlow Ridge, Colorado that I have owned since 2006, where I keep a small spiral notebook in the second drawer beside the stove and a garden that is doing better than it was a year ago. Last Sunday, my daughter called while I was reading in the back room. "Dad," she said, "would you like to have lunch this week?" I said yes. We are meeting on Wednesday. That is the full account of the situation. That is the number I care about. That is everything. I am not a man who speaks about faith often. But I will say this once plainly. I believe that the timing of that email, 2 letters off autofill, 11 o'clock on a November evening, was not something I arranged. I received it. I am grateful for that. The lesson I would offer you from this family story is not about trust funds or legal architecture. It is simpler and harder than that document. What matters, protect what you love, and do both long before you need to. I waited too long to name what I was seeing. Do not wait as long as I did. Watch the questions people ask. Watch the patterns, not the performance. Do not be like me. Do not sit on information, because you are afraid of what acting on it will cost. The cost of waiting is always higher. My personal belief after 60 years of living inside one family story after another is this: the people who come for what you have built always underestimate the people who built it, every single time. That is the truth at the center of every grandpa stories worth telling. If this grandpa stories resonated with something in your own experience, a relationship tested, a silence that ran too long, a trust broken in a quiet house, leave a comment below. Share this family story with someone who needs it. And if grandpa stories like this one are worth your time, the subscribe button is right there, and it costs you nothing. Thank you for staying with this until the end. It means more than I know how to say. A note: before we continue, some of the stories ahead carry fictional elements built for the purpose of illustration and reflection. If that is not the kind of content you are looking for, please find something better suited to you. No hard feelings and no obligation to stay. Take care of the people who are still there to be taken care of.